Hello, everyone. Joining us today. My name is Andrea Glispie, and I'm senior manager of community development at Charles Schwab Bank. And I hope everyone is finding themselves at a good place as we are wrapping up the end of the week. Um, this is an inaugural webinar that the Dallas Housing Coalition is putting on, just to bring greater attention to issues around housing in the Dallas community. And I'm fortunate enough to serve as one of the founding board members of the Housing Coalition. And since today is the day that we are hosting the first installment of our webinar, Housing for All, where we discuss whether Dallas is big and if it is truly big enough for everyone. As some of you are catching right now, the webinar series is and will be going forward live streamed on all of Dallas Housing Coalition social channels, most Fridays at 11 a.m. Central Time through the beginning of 2024. And with each webinar that we host as part of this series, our plan is to have brief but impactful one-on-one conversations with coalition members and other community leaders who are Dallas's strongest advocates for keeping the city affordable. I'm really excited about this first installment of our series because I am joined by Ashley Flores of the Child Action Poverty Lab. Ashley is the Chief of Housing, and the Child Action Poverty Lab, if you're not already familiar with it, is a local nonprofit committed to cutting child poverty in Dallas in half within 20 years. In her role as Chief of Housing, Ashley is focused on housing as it relates to poverty and is intent on ensuring that all families have access to housing that is healthy and safe, affordable, stable, and in thriving communities. She previously served as the Director of Planning and Special Projects at the Dallas Independent School District, championing and operating the district's work around innovative school design and personalized learning, as well as turning around schools. Ashley earned degrees in business administration and liberal arts from the University of Texas at Austin, and in education policy and management from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. Welcome, Ashley, and happy Friday.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we are lucky to have you. I'm sure you are a busy lady, as many of us are with the end of the year approaching. So really, I just want folks to get a chance to know you a little bit better before we really talk more about housing. And you have a wonderful biography. I'm sure there's many more things we could say about your career and what led you to CPAL. But I was just wondering, just in your free time when you're not reading reports or going over data about housing and related issues, what has been your favorite book that you've come across so far this year? Or the book that's made you laugh the most, think the most, whatever it may be.
Yeah, but you hit the nail on the head. I read a lot of reports and research for work purposes. So in my free time, I really love reading fiction. And recently I've been reading books by author Louise Erdrich, who's a Minnesota-based author. I just recently finished her most recent book called The Sentence, which is loosely based on her. She has an independent bookstore in Minneapolis called Birch Bark Books, which is very cute, awesome independent bookstore. Shout out to Birch Bark if you're ever in Minneapolis. And so it's loosely based on that bookstore, and I won't give too much away, but there's a haunt in the bookstore, and it's set during COVID, so it's sort of in recent memory. But that's most recent book that I read that I really enjoyed.
Ooh, that sounds really good. I've got it written down. I've got a few days I'm going to be able to string together between Christmas and New Year where I'm going to do a bunch of reading, and that's probably, hopefully, going to be something I get to. So thanks for that. Well, just a little bit more about the organization that you work with. We know that Child Poverty Action Lab works with a lot of data surrounding poverty in Dallas, and not just for adolescents and children. With all the data that you look at, what statistics are the ones that keep you up at night when it comes to housing in Dallas?
So, at CPAL, as you mentioned, our work is focused on increasing upward economic mobility. So when I think about what keeps me up at night in terms of housing, I think in particular of housing affordability and also stability, two levers that we know have just tremendous impact on economic opportunity. In terms of affordability, we know that when residents are housing cost burden, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing expenses, that they're forced to make trade-offs. They sacrifice other expenditures like nutritious food, preventative health care, educational opportunities, just to keep a roof over their head. And when your housing cost burden, that stress of unaffordable housing weighs really heavy on residents and can manifest in mental and physical health issues, can have a negative impact on academic achievement, and more. So when we look at the city of Dallas data on renters who are housing cost burden, we know across all renters in the city, regardless of their income level, 48% are housing cost burden. Nearly 1 in 2 renters in the city are potentially overpaying for housing and are contemplating these really difficult trade-offs. We also know that certain renters are overrepresented in that population. 55% of our senior renters, for example, are housing cost burden. We know that many seniors are on fixed incomes and the fixed income can't keep pace with the rapidly escalating rent costs. We also know that 55% of Black renters are cost burden, and 74%, almost 3/4 of our single parents in the city who are renting are cost burden. The last thing I'll say here is that, part of the reason why so many renters are cost burden is because our rental housing supply doesn't match the demand. We recently at CPAL released a rental housing needs assessment that we conducted with HRNA advisors, and we found that we're short 33,660 rental units affordable to low-income renters at or below 50% of area median income, which is between 44 and 45,000 for a family of 4. So in other words, the demand is much greater than the supply for affordably priced units. And so that's why we see households that are increasingly cost burden in the city. I'll stop there. I can add more to what keeps me up at night, but that might be a good stopping place.
Yeah, that's plenty. And you raised 2 really good points. The issue about being housing cost burden, and I don't think enough people hear about that or really understand that. Because I could definitely think of plenty of times in my life where I fell in that category, even though, I had a good education, I had what seemed, good jobs, but housing adds up and it does take up a significant chunk of almost anyone's budget. So you may not know, you could be working with people all the time and not realize how strapped they are when it comes to being able to balance housing costs with other things that takes to run a household. So I think that's a very important point. What are some other interesting findings in your recent rental housing needs assessment and the housing calculator that CPAL just released?
So I'll highlight a few of additional findings that I think will be particularly interesting to anyone who's tuning in, but also would just encourage folks who want to dig deeper into the full report. We have it on our website at childpovertyactionlab.org/rental housing. It's a beast. It's over 100 pages long, so there's lots of really rich insights in it beyond what we have time to share today. But a couple of things that I'll add just to build on that 33,000 unit gap that we've already talked about is that when we were doing the rental housing needs assessment, when we dug into the gap between supply and demand, we were also interested in the gap by household size, not just by income. And so when we looked at household size, we found that for larger household sizes in particular, folks with households with 4 or more people, they face an acute shortage of rentals that meet their needs when they're a lower income renter household. So for households of 4 or more people at 50% area median income, there are just 50 affordable units for every 100 households. So we only have about half of what we need for those larger family renters that are looking for affordable units. And so that really jumped out to us too, is that when we're thinking about creating a shared understanding of the housing challenges in Dallas, it's not enough just to say, well, here are our needs by income level. We also have to be thinking about the different family contexts, different needs based on household size, number of bedrooms that someone might be looking for, as we're factoring in, as we're setting goals and thinking about what we need to build or preserve in the city. A couple of things that we also looked at, we were interested in the relationship between wages and housing affordability. The housing affordability is a function of your income, how much you're making, as well as the price point of the rentals, how much you're being charged for rent. And what we found when we looked at the DFW metro area is that the top 4 most common job types, which are transportation and material moving, office and admin support, food service and prep, and sales, all of those have median wages that are below $40,500. So if you're making a salary of $40,500, if you're striving not to spend more than 30% of your gross income on rent, then you're looking for a rental priced around $1,000 a month, which those are very few and far in between within the city of Dallas. And so we know that the prevalence of low wage jobs in the region is one of the drivers of the big gap between supply and demand. 2 more quick notes I'll throw out that might be interesting to listeners. Related to that, we also looked at the connection between educational attainment, and housing affordability. Earnings typically increase by educational attainment. You know, we know that if you have an associate's degree, you typically earn more than a high school diploma, and so on. And so we wanted to know, you know, what are the median wages by educational attainment, and how do they relate to what you need to earn to afford a rental in Dallas? And I think one of the most surprising things that we found is that for bachelor's degree holders in the city of Dallas, the median wage is around $64,000. But the median wage needed to afford the median rent in Dallas is closer to $67,000. So even residents with bachelor's degrees in Dallas might not be able to afford rent without spending more than 30% of their income on rent. Then the last kind of interesting fact I'll point out is just something that we saw in the data was the really interesting change over time in the share of renters versus homeowners by income level in Dallas. So we looked backwards as well. We compared 2011 data to 2021 data, and we found that in 2021 and beyond, higher income households are increasingly remaining renters. Historically, higher income renters would make their way into home ownership and then free up rental units in the market, but that's less and less the case. So for example, among households that earned between $100,000 and $150,000 in 2011, 70% were homeowners, 30% were renters. But by 2021, for that same income band, just 51% were homeowners and 49% were renters. So we're seeing folks remain in the rental market longer, even as their income is increasing, instead of moving into homeownership, because of the challenges in the homeownership market.
Wow, that is really all very startling and illuminating information that you just shared for us. Because when we started this webinar, one of the biggest headlines that you gave us is that supply is not matching demand when it comes to housing, that we have much higher demand for housing especially at specific income levels than what we have available. But it sounds like you've really pulled the cover back on this statistic, and it tells an even graver story through your research than what we initially thought. I mean, so it's not, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like that the bigger size of your household, the harder it is to find what you need at an affordable point for you based on your wages. Wages has a big issue. So if you're working at jobs that yield wages under or about $40,000 a year, that's going to cut down on your options. But then these other two statistics are really interesting because lots of us say that education, if we can just help people get the right education or get as much education as possible, that's a good thing. But you're even finding that people with bachelor's of art degrees, four-year college degrees, they're hitting an affordability issue. And then the other thing that I really had not heard is that higher income households that should be moving from renting to home ownership are not the way that we thought they were, which is also cutting into supply and what's available. Did I miss anything? Is that's really what's happening?
Yeah, you covered it. You covered it.
Wow. Well, given what we know about the problem, let's try and put a little bit of positivity in this conversation and talk about solutions. Can you give any highlights or highlight any instances where data has been instrumental in designing interventions and policies that really directly benefit individuals and families that are experiencing poverty or struggling with housing affordability?
Yeah, so I think I'll actually pivot to housing stability to give some examples here in the affordability space. I think we've really worked over the last year to create that shared understanding of the problem using data, and now we're beginning to also use data to think about solutions. But where we can look backwards and see success in using data to inform solutions, I think is really in the eviction prevention space. And so something else that, going back to your question about what keeps me up at night, besides affordability, I also think a lot about housing stability, which is inextricably linked to affordability. And we have a lot of evictions that are filed in this city, lots of households that are displaced. Just as quick stat, through November of 2023 in the city of Dallas, we've had over 21,000 evictions filed, which is an average of 63 evictions per day. And we know that about 65% of eviction filings are due to non-payment of rent. And so I think it's a fair hypothesis to say that those non-payment of rent cases stem from a mismatch between household wages and rent prices, that lack of housing affordability. But moving to solutions, during COVID, we had this urgent focus on housing stability, and we wanted to keep as many people as possible housed for lots of reasons. Some, one reason being sort of the health crisis we were in, making sure people could stay safe and protected, but then also making sure that all households had safe places to live and to stay and didn't have to worry about the threat or of an imminent move. And so starting during COVID and continuing today, I think an example that comes to mind that highlights how data has been really instrumental in designing targeted interventions is that the use of eviction filing data to do direct outreach to tenants facing eviction. So at CPAL, we have been able to work with Dallas County to access nearly real-time eviction filing data. And we share that with partner organizations. We started doing this during COVID, like the Dallas Eviction Advocacy Center, so that they can connect immediately with renters facing eviction to try and mitigate the situation and keep renters housed. This data was also used during COVID when the city and its partners had tens of millions of dollars in rent relief that they were trying to disperse quickly and effectively. That eviction filing data pointed us to eviction hotspots, neighborhoods, apartment complexes, where there was a real density of eviction filings, so that organizations with rent relief and legal aid could go proactively to those neighborhoods to host outreach events, do tenant education, offer application assistance to those most in need. So that data was very instrumental during COVID, continues to be really critical to do that immediate direct outreach to households that are on the brink potentially of losing their home.
That's amazing. I can't really think of a better example of data leading towards target interventions, and just the fact that you've been able to keep tabs on evictions and down to how many are being filed per day is very amazing. But then you're able to use that data to really sound the alarm for nonprofits it sounds like that can then go out and work with these families and try to help them problem solve and find a solution. That's a great example. And it just really goes to show that data isn't always about telling, sharing things that maybe people don't want to hear, but it's a way of really pointing towards how we can make change in positive ways. So that's very exciting. Just as we round out our conversation, as we look ahead into 2024 and beyond, what are some other key challenges or opportunities do you foresee where you can continue your good work of leveraging data to address affordable housing and poverty?
When I think about using data to address affordable housing, I think the biggest opportunity, which I've alluded to, is to use data to first create a shared understanding of the problem, but then to set goals and then to monitor progress over time to making sure that we're achieving the goals that we set. Before CPAL set out to do the rental housing needs assessment, we started that project about a year ago, but before we actually started that analysis, we'd been hearing for years that Dallas needs more housing, that we have a shortage of affordable housing. But we hadn't gotten much more granular than that. We knew there was a need, but we didn't know the size and shape of the need in a way that could really inform action in a specific way. So what we wanted to know as we were going into the rental housing needs assessment were things like exactly how much housing do we need, at what price points, how big should the units be to be appropriately sized for various household needs? Where do we need to build more affordable housing? There's a whole host of questions that we wanted to dig into to really create a clear, crisp problem statements that we could offer solutions against. And so in the rental housing needs assessment, we begin to answer some of these questions. And our hope is that the data will create the shared understanding of the problem that we can work from and that we can use to ensure that solutions are ultimately matching our needs. So that's the opportunity I see, is really using data to better define the problem, to set goals, and then to monitor progress over time to make sure we're doing what our residents need.
That's fantastic. I can't think of a better way, a better reason why we need to invest in data capacity at places like Child Action Poverty Lab, and then how powerful data can be in really helping everyone hone in on solutions and interventions that we know can work based on what the data tells us. Can you remind folks again where they can find the rental housing assessment?
Yes, it's at childpovertyactionlab.org/rental housing.
Fantastic. Well, Ashley, I can't thank you enough for joining us for our first webinar in our series on housing issues in Dallas, Housing for All, as we're calling it. Thank you so much for getting us started, but most importantly, just raising the alarm on these critical issues related to housing stability and affordability.
Thanks so much for having me, and I hope folks will check out the full rental housing needs assessment as they're learning more about the issues.
I've got it tabbed right now, so I know I will be. Great. Well, thank you again. And just to all of our listeners and viewers today, thank you so much for joining us for this first installment. As I mentioned, this will be a somewhat regular web series that Dallas Housing Coalition will be putting on through the first part of 2024. If you are curious about learning more about the work of Dallas Housing Coalition, please visit the coalition's website at dallashousingcoalition.com. There, not only can you learn more about the work of the coalition, but also many of its partner organizations or member organizations, such as CPAL, the Child Action Poverty Lab. So a lot to learn there. We hope you visit the site. And also, when you're on the website, one of the key things that the coalition is working on and keeping tabs on is the City of Dallas's 2024 bond program. So you can read more about their efforts around that and how you can take part in supporting how Dallas decides to invest, what their anticipating to be $1.1 billion in bond proceeds next year. And as long as you're on the coalition's website and reading about its members and learning about the bond program, join the coalition. The door is always open for new members. I know the coalition can't do anything of what it does without its members. So I know the coalition would be happy to have you. Thank you, Ashley, again for joining us today. And I also just want to give one last thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in to the very first Housing for All webinar, where we discuss whether Dallas is big and if it is truly big enough for everyone. Tune in next week, December 15th, and after the new year for our next couple of webinars, where we'll have another expert shed the light on issues facing housing in Dallas.